Welcome to the Malt YouTube channel, homebrewers. In this video, we're putting to the test 3 dried yeast strains that have been super popular over the last few years that really focus on brewing juicy, hop-forward New England Pale Ales and IPAs. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the dry yeast market has exploded, with so many more variants available now, beer styles open to be brewed, and real nuance within the range that gives homebrewers the joy of tons of options where they can pick the nuance that they want for their specific brew. Now, in the past, this was an arena that was only really occupied by using liquid yeast strains, but the playing field has definitely changed of late. And so for this video, we've brewed one big 60-litre batch of one of my Hazy Pale Ale recipes. We've split it across 3 fermenters, so it's exactly the same work, the same hops, the same dry hopping regime, the same water. The only difference has been the yeast strain that we've chosen. And they're 3 really popular strains for those that are trying to brew hazy New England style of beers at home. Before we dive into the yeast strains that we're going to be using, just a bit on the recipe itself. So overall, we used 65% of Simpson's extra pale malt for our base malt, 20% flaked oats, 9% wheat malt, and then 6% dextrin. It's a recipe that I've used time and time again when brewing hazy pale ales at home, and it does work perfectly. It balances fermentables with things like oats that are going to give us that slickness and body that we want in the beer style. And then for hops, we've gone really classic for this kind of beer style using Citra and Mosaic. We added a touch of Magnum, just 10 grams at the beginning of the boil to give us 5 IBUs. Now, after that, we then focused on picking up some extra IBUs from our whirlpool where we use Citra and Mosaic in equal parts to a ratio of 6.6 grams per litre. That gave us around about another 20 IBUs in total. And then for dry hopping as well, we dry hopped all the beers in the same way, just using Citra, again at 6.6 grams per litre. The water profile I used for this beer, again, was one you would expect for this kind of beer style. The key thing here is the ratio between sulfate and chlorides, which is 2 to 1 in favour of chlorides. That again gives us the kind of body and the experience that we want in terms of mouthfeel for this beer style. So we're really just focusing here on what difference the yeast is going to bring to the finished beer. So which yeasts are we going to be using, you might be wondering? Well, they are a mixture of some classics and some new ones on the scene that have been really popular. So first off, we're going to be using Verdant IPA yeast by Brew. This yeast, when it launched, was a real trailblazer. It was one of the first really strong contenders to be able to brew a hazy pale ale using a dry yeast strain. It's got such an amazing origin, obviously being from Verdant itself, a brewery we know and love and absolutely adore the beers they produce. And their yeast is a big part of that overall story for Verdant's beers. Next up is a new contender on the scene, and it's Haze Heaven from WHC. This is a yeast that I've really found interesting to use. It heralds from a London fog kind of strain, so it's really good for producing haze in the beer and can offer an array of complex flavours and aromas. So we'll take a look at that and see how that shows up in the finished beer as well. And then last but by no means least, WHC Saturated. Again, this launched in dry format a couple of years ago and has been really popular. It offers some of the same kind of versatility as Verdant IPA, being able to be used in a wide range of beer styles, but again, it really does shine in those juicy pale ales and IPAs. Now, just a note on attenuation. So Lallemans say that Verdant IPA should be a medium to high attenuation. Haze Heaven from WHC, a moderate attenuation, 76 to 80%, and then saturated medium again, so around about 73 to 77%. So again, we will take a look at the final gravity when we get to talking about the results and see just how these beers finished up from that perspective. Now, we pitched these yeasts side by side in the same fermenters under the same conditions at the same temperatures and allowed them to complete fermentation. Then I moved on to dry hop. After the fermentation was complete, we soft crashed, drew off yeast, added the dry hops, I allowed a 48-hour contact time. I purposefully didn't rouse the hops in this case because actually 6.6 grams of a dry hop is probably a little bit less than I would do personally at home, and I wanted to really give the yeast an opportunity to shine through, so I didn't rouse the hops with that in mind. After that, we drew off the hops once we'd cold crashed, packaged them up into kegs, so they've then been sat in one of our cold stores, carbonating up to the same level of carbonation, which is around about 2.4 volumes. After that, I allowed them a good week or so just of conditioning time, just to let things kind of mellow out and kind of settle throughout the brews, before we then moved on to actually putting them in front of some of the team here at the Malt Miller and asking them to complete a short questionnaire about each beer and to look for some of the differences within them. Before we sort of dive into kind of how the yeast showed up with our participants, I want to talk a little bit about attenuation. So as I said earlier, the attenuation that we expected based on what is suggested by the supplier of the yeasts, it can sometimes vary, but let's just take a quick look at actually what we saw in the finished glass. So Verdant was our lowest attenuation, coming in at 70%. So that is quite low, but we know that this yeast can be a little bit fickle at times. In fact, when we visited Verdant, James himself said that it can be a bit sluggish if we don't give it the right conditions. Haze Heaven, that attenuated really high at 80%, and then saturated somewhere in the middle around about 74%. So it's really interesting to see that the three yeast strains all attenuated differently, and there was actually quite a wide spread, which may or may not show up in the glass when our tasters tried the beers. But let's dive into this attenuation in a little bit more detail. Now, it's worth noting we mashed our grains for this batch of beer at 70 degrees, which is quite high. Not as high as I have done for some other beers that I've brewed in this style, but kind of a higher range, shall we say. It should have left us with lots and lots of longer chain sugars that the yeast would have found tricky to ferment, and leaving us with more body and a little bit more sweetness in the beer, also helping to reduce the perceived bitterness. Now, Verdant finished with a final gravity of 1.017, which is quite high. Like I said, about a 70% attenuation, where WHC saturated come in at 1.015, which is kind of about where I would expect. And then Haze Heaven actually finished really low at 1.011. Now, that's similar to the experience I've had when I use that yeast strain. And it's actually something I quite like about that yeast strain, because it does attenuate well, but still leaves quite a bit of body, but balances it with drinkability in my experience. So let's dive into the results and a little bit about how we conducted this. Now, we're not as scientific here as some of the other channels out there that do this kind of stuff. In fact, this is one of the first times we've done something like this, but we still put it in front of 7 of our team here, and the team all had slightly different experiences when it comes to trying beer and tasting beer and ultimately assessing beer. Some of which, like Rob, Reiki, they have done lots and lots of professional judging. Then we also asked a couple of the other team members who maybe are less trained on this kind of stuff to get their thoughts and scores, so that we had a little bit of a spread in terms of experience and to see actually how the scores stacked up when we combined them all together. Now, some of the measures we put in place to make sure this was quite impartial, we made sure that all of the tasters had numbered glasses where they didn't know which yeast strains had been used, but they did know that the beer was brewed from one single batch. So they had that in mind. They knew what hops were in there so that they could try and unpick some of the differences based on that. And we served it to them in clear glasses. Now, at times it can benefit from serving people beer within glasses that are not clear, so that they're not visually skewed, but we did want them to assess certain elements like how opaque the beer presented, because we wanted to see just how the kind of haze stability or haze presence showed up, because it's such an important factor with this beer style. So we asked the team to score from 1 to 10 on a number of different categories. Now, before I tell you about the categories, we chose 1 to 10. Let's take opacity as an example. 1 would be really bright beer, clear, crystal clear, like a lager, but then 10 would be the thickest, juiciest beer you've ever seen. This just gave them enough leeway to kind of unpick the subtlety between each of the different categories we looked at. On that, we asked them to assess the presentation of things like tropical fruit presence, both in aroma and flavour, citrus fruit, stone fruit, haze, so opacity. We put phenolics in there as well, just to see if anybody could pick up anything a little bit more phenolic from each of the yeasts. body and dryness. Now, body and dryness, you might think are the same thing, but they can also be separated. So a beer could be quite dry, but still have quite a lot of body. And equally, it could be less dry, but lack body. So we wanted to separate those two things and get an indicator from the team whether they could pick up any of those particular characteristics. So let's take a look at the results and see just how each of these yeasts stacked up. So let's start with the tropical fruit presence. Now, interestingly, both Verdant and Saturated scored 6 out of 10 on this, whereas Haze Heaven was a touch lower at 5 out of 10. Giving Verdant and Saturated that little bit more of a juicy kind of edge to them. On citrus fruit, Verdant actually shone above both of the others, so quite a nice blend there from Verdant showing up both in terms of tropical fruit and citrus fruit. Now, stone fruit, so that's that lovely kind of peachy or nectarine kind of vibe that you can get, maybe a little bit of mango. Actually, Verdant and Haze Heaven both came out as 5 out of 10, Saturated 4 out of 10. So hops have probably driven some of that, but Saturated was maybe just a little bit more muted on that stone fruit front. Now, this is a big one, opacity, so just how hazy each of them showed up. And living up to its name, Haze Heaven stood above the other two. Yes, just by 1 point, but these yeasts are all going to produce haze. But really interesting that Haze Heaven lives up to what it says and was just that little bit thicker in the glass. Now, none of the yeasts presented much in the way of phenolics, although some of the participants found that Haze Heaven was a little bit more phenolic than the others. Now, in terms of body, now, yes, some of this will be down to the water profile that I used for the brew, but Verdant and Haze Heaven both came out with a slightly higher score, 6 out of 10 versus Saturated 5 out of 10. So again, whilst it is a little bit of a marginal thing there, if we think back to the attenuation results, now Haze Heaven attenuated much higher. In fact, Haze Heaven finished with a final gravity of 1.011 versus Verdant's 1.017. But they both scored similar in terms of body. And I think that goes to show that there is some interesting things that can happen in terms of, things like glycerin and some of the other factors that the yeast can bring to promote body in the beer. Now, dryness, all three scored 6 out of 10, which is interesting again when we think about the fact that the attenuation levels were different across all three beers, and that sometimes dryness is not just about residual sugar, it can be much more than that. Now, it's really interesting when we take a look at the spider graph, because generally speaking, each yeast does kind of fall within a similar ballpark for its characteristics and attributes, but there are subtle nuances within there that I think when we take those into account with the attenuation that you can gain from these yeasts, actually it gives you the scope to brew something that is a little bit more to your palate or your taste. Personally, as I've said, I quite like the dryness that you can get from Haze Heaven because it is still balanced with lots of body and that really thick, juicy appearance that you can get, which is kind of what showed up for us in our results as well. But equally, if you're looking to find a yeast that will pair really nicely to the characteristics of the hops you're using, this could be really interesting and helpful for you to think about that. You know, if you're using lots and lots of citrus forward hops, then, you know, choosing the yeast that stood out for that may complement your beer style. But there's so much that you can do to kind of play around with this and think about it. For me, the link between body, dryness and attenuation that maybe is the biggest learn here. Whilst all of these yeasts produced the beer styles that we would expect, there were some differences within that particular topic. And that's something I think that could be really useful to have a play around with in my next brews or in some of the recipes that I'm going to be working on within this category over the next little while. Now, I love all three of these yeast strains. You know, I've used all of them in different beers over the years to kind of really help me hone in on perfecting that homebrewed Hazy Pale Ale or IPA. But having done this, I think it's going to give me the opportunity to just think a little bit more closely about which yeast style I'm going to choose for what I want in the end result. The big thing, as I've mentioned just a minute ago, is the perceived dryness factor for me. That was really interesting. I think it really comes down to drinkability. Having tried all three beers side by side, for me, the one with Haze Heaven just gives it that little bit more drinkability, although some of our participants found that actually Saturated for them was a little bit more drinkable. But it was just interesting to see how each of them stacked up. So that's it, folks. I hope this has helped some of you in thinking about which yeast strain you might use for your next recipe. But equally, if you've got questions or thoughts about this topic, drop them down in the comments section below. I'd love to hear them. Equally, if you think there's anything we can do to kind of push this topic further, maybe there's 3 different yeast strains that you'd like to see us do a comparison for, or even maybe 3 different malts, do let us know. This is something that's going to become really interesting, I think, over the next little while, to do some of these more kind of side-by-side brews and interpretations to see exactly how some of our ingredients really do stack up and what the differences or similarities might be. Now, if you've made it to the end of the video and you're not already, please do subscribe to our channel, hit the bell for notifications, and if you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. That really does help us out. And if you want to stay up to date with everything else we're doing here at Malt Miller HQ, make sure that you hit the links down below to all of our social channels and subscribe to our newsletter. See you next time. Have a great brew.